I was reading the introductory paragraph to chapter 15 today, the one on biodiversity and conservation.
Oh, right, the classic opening.
Yeah, and it really struck me how the authors framed the entire subject right out of the gate. I mean, we hear the word biodiversity tossed around so often that it can start to feel like white noise, you know?
Absolutely, it just becomes another buzzword.
Exactly. It sounds like just another standard textbook term, a vocabulary word you're supposed to memorize for a test and then just move on from. But looking closely at this specific text today, it became super clear that the authors are attempting something much more ambitious.
They really are. They aren't just giving us a definition.
No, they're trying to force a complete shift in perspective. They use this fascinating thought experiment about an alien visiting Earth to recontextualize the sheer statistical reality of life on this planet. It literally blew my mind. It made me realize how totally numb we generally are to the scale of the biological systems right around us. Welcome to the deep dive, everyone.
Glad to be here for this one.
Today, our mission is to map out the foundational concepts, the pedagogical strategies, and the crucial high-yield numbers embedded in this exact chapter introduction. We're going to unpack the roadmap it provides for understanding one of the most complex topics in science. Okay, let's unpack this.
It is incredibly valuable to start right there, focusing on the framing, because that shift in perspective you mentioned is exactly what the authors of this text are aiming for. As an educator who has spent over 15 years mentoring students, specifically those preparing for high-stakes medical entrance exams like the Neet, I can tell you that this introduction is where the battle is either won or lost.
Really? Just in the introduction?
Oh, without a doubt.
Hmm.
Most students, under the massive pressure of an impending exam, they just want to rush past the introductory paragraphs. They're hunting for the bolded terms.
Right, the equations, the summary bullet points.
Exactly. They view the introduction as filler. But in doing so, they miss the entire architectural blueprint of the chapter. This introduction exists to solve a massive conceptual problem for the learner. It forces you to confront your own preconceived notions and recognize your place in a staggeringly complex biosphere before you even attempt to study its mechanics.
So it's setting the stage.
It's building the foundation. For you listening, whether you are meticulously prepping for an exam or you simply want to develop a more rigorous understanding of the natural world, we're going to look at exactly how this text constructs that mental map. And crucially, we will explore how examiners use the specific language in these opening lines to test your reading comprehension and your scientific mindset.
I love that. So if the goal of this introduction is to break us out of our complacency, that opening sentence really does the heavy lifting. The text sets up an extraterrestrial thought experiment. It reads, if an alien from a distant galaxy were to visit our planet Earth, the first thing that would amaze and baffle him would most probably be the enormous diversity of life that he would encounter.
It's a striking image.
It's such an elegant piece of biological design, pedagogically speaking. The author uses an imaginary, highly advanced being to hold up a mirror to us, to make us realize how completely blind we are to the extraordinary realities happening in our own backyards.
Let us really dissect the words chosen in that opening sentence, because every single one is doing specific work. The text explicitly places this imaginary alien in a distant galaxy. Now, why is that specific detail important?
To show they've traveled a long way.
Right, but by positing a being from a distant galaxy, the text implies a level of technological and intellectual advancement that far surpasses our own. This is a hypothetical entity capable of interstellar travel, which requires a mastery of physics, engineering, and cosmology that we can barely fathom.
Oh, I see.
Yet the text asserts that when this vastly superior intellect arrives on Earth, the very first thing that captures their attention isn't our human technology. It's not our cities or our infrastructure.
It's the biological diversity.
Exactly, it's the biology.
That is a brilliant way to level the playing field. It humbles the human reader immediately. The text is essentially saying that no matter how advanced a civilization gets, the sheer complexity of Earth's biology remains the ultimate marvel. And the verbs the text uses to describe the alien's reaction are really striking. Amaze and baffle.
Precisely. Those two verbs are the crux of the rhetorical strategy here. Amaze indicates a profound emotional or aesthetic response. It's the feeling of awe.
Like looking at a sunset or a massive canyon.
Yes. Baffle, on the other hand, is an intellectual response. It implies confusion, a disruption of logic, an inability to immediately comprehend how such a system could exist or function.
Because it's just so overwhelmingly complex.
Right, the text is telling you that the sheer variety of life on Earth defies simple logical deduction, even to a superior intellect. It cannot be easily modeled or predicted from a distance. It must be observed and untangled. If a highly advanced alien is intellectually baffled by this diversity, the text is implicitly asking the student, how much more seriously should you be taking this?
Wow. It really sets the bar for the complexity of the chapter. If you aren't a little bit confused and a lot amazed by the time you finish studying biodiversity, you probably haven't understood it.
That's a very fair assessment.
And this perfectly sets up the contrast the text introduces next. After establishing the reaction of this super advanced alien, the text immediately pivots to the human perspective. It acknowledges that even for humans, the rich variety of living organisms with which they share this planet never ceases to astonish and fascinate us. But then it introduces this concept of the common man. It says that the common man would find the actual numbers hard to believe.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this introduction of the common man is where the pedagogical genius of the textbook really shines.
Why is that?
Well, why bring up the common man in a scientific text? The common man in this context represents the baseline state of complacency. It represents the passive observer. The common man walks past a forest and perceives a forest, entirely missing the millions of interacting species, the microecosystems, and the evolutionary history occurring within that space.
They just see green trees and maybe a bird.
Exactly. The common man accepts that there are different animals and plants, but as the text points out, they cannot fully grasp the magnitude of the actual numbers.
So the text is using the alien and the common man as two opposite ends of a spectrum of awareness.
Yes.
The common man is surrounded by the diversity but blind to its true scale. The alien is completely foreign to it, but immediately recognizes its staggering, baffling complexity. As a reader, you are basically suspended between these two archetypes.
Exactly. And the unstated mandate of this introduction is that as a student of biology, you can no longer remain the common man. You must adopt the analytical gaze of the alien. You have to transition from passively sharing the planet to actively interrogating it.
That makes a lot of sense.
If we look ahead to the structure of the chapter, you cannot possibly understand the principles of conservation, which the text outlines as section 15.2, until you are appropriately and thoroughly baffled by the biodiversity outlined in section 15.1. The text is building an epistemological foundation. You have to comprehend the staggering scale of the system before you can value it enough to protect it.
You cannot recognize what is being lost if you have no concept of what is actually there.
Precisely.
If the goal is to jolt the common man out of complacency, the next logical step the author takes is to show us the actual scale of what we are ignoring. The text doesn't just leave it at vague statements about rich variety. It drops a series of specific data points to force that realization. Let's look at the numbers the author uses to do this because they are presented in a very deliberate way.
When I sit down with a student who is struggling to break past a certain score plateau on the Neet or similar exams, we often go back to paragraphs exactly like this one. They will read the data points, maybe underline them, and move on.
Just rote memorization.
Right. But these numbers are not just interesting trivia included for flavor. In the context of a highly competitive exam, these specific figures are foundational. They are the objective facts upon which examiners build multiple-choice questions to test both recall and precise reading comprehension.
Let's unpack the specific data points the text provides then. It gives us 4 examples to illustrate this baffling diversity. First, it tells us there are more than 20,000 species of ants. When you really stop to think about that, it forces a massive shift in how you picture the world. That is not 20,000 individual ants.
No, not at all.
That is 20,000 completely distinct taxonomic classifications, 20,000 different evolutionary solutions to the problem of survival, all within the single category of ants.
It is a profound concentration of diversity. And notice the immediate pairing the text utilizes next. Directly alongside the ants, it mentions orchids. The text states there are nearly 20,000 species of orchids. This is not a random juxtaposition. The authors have deliberately chosen to place an insect and a plant side by side to demonstrate that this hyperspeciation isn't limited to one kingdom of life.
Here's where it gets really interesting. There is a really striking symmetry there. You have a highly active social insect, the ant, and a stationary, often highly specialized plant, the orchid, both hovering right around that same massive threshold of 20,000 species.
It's a great observation.
It creates this numerical balance right at the start of the data set, showing that complexity is woven evenly across vastly different forms of life.
That symmetry is beautiful from an ecological standpoint, but from a test-taking standpoint, it is a highly exploitable area.
Hmm?
This is exactly where I see students lose points.
How so? Because they mix them up.
Exactly. Because the numbers are so similar, both anchored around the 20,000 mark, examiners will frequently swap the plant and the insect in the options of a multiple-choice question. A student reading too quickly might see an option that says 300,000 species of ants and 20,000 species of beetles, and their brain, recognizing the numbers but failing to connect them to the correct taxa, might just select it.
Oh man, that's a classic trap.
It is. You must firmly lock in your mind that ants and orchids are the specific pairing anchored near 20,000.
That really highlights why reading a textbook requires such active focus. You aren't just reading for the gist, you're mapping the relationships between the data points. Okay, let's look at the next number. The text moves from ants and orchids to fishes, stating there are 28,000 species of fishes. So we see a distinct step up in the magnitude.
We do. We move from the 20,000 tier to the 28,000 tier. But this is merely a stepping stone to the final and most crucial data point in this introductory paragraph.
The beetles. The text explicitly states there are 3,000, that is 300,000 species of beetles. The sheer magnitude of this number compared to the other three is entirely disproportionate.
It's massive.
We jump from 20,000 and 28,000 all the way to 300,000. It is a full order of magnitude larger. It completely dwarfs the other examples.
And that disproportionate scale is exactly what makes it a critical piece of information. Examiners will frequently ask a direct, absolute question based on this excerpt. They'll ask, according to the introduction of the Biodiversity chapter, which of the following groups possesses the maximum number of species?
And they list those four.
Exactly. They will list the four groups provided: ants, orchids, fishes, and beetles. Because beetles sit at that massive 300,000 mark, they are the undisputed statistical champions of this specific text. A student must immediately associate beetles with the absolute maximum volume whenever recalling this foundational data.
It really emphasizes the baffling nature of the diversity the alien would see. If you think about the morphological variations required to produce 300,000 distinct species of beetles, it stretches human comprehension.
It truly does.
But going back to the text, I noticed something else about how these numbers are presented. The author doesn't just say 20,000 ants and 20,000 orchids. They use very specific linguistic modifiers.
Ah, yes.
The text says more than 20,000 species of ants and nearly 20,000 species of orchids. Why would the text be that pedantic? Why not just say around 20,000 for both and save the word count?
That is a phenomenal observation, and it cuts to the core of how scientific texts communicate precision. It is also the exact kind of granular distinction that separates a top-tier exam candidate from an average one. The authors are not being pedantic at all. They're being scientifically accurate.
Okay.
More than implies that the 20,000 threshold has been crossed and verified. Nearly implies that the number approaches 20,000, but has not definitively crossed it.
So even though they share that symmetrical 20,000 anchor, their actual trajectory relative to that number is different. Ants are above the line, orchids are just below it.
Precisely. And in the context of an exam, test makers use these exact modifiers to create high-difficulty Statement 1 and Statement 2 type questions.
Oh, I hate those questions.
Everyone does. But this is how you beat them.
Mm.
They might present a statement that reads, there are nearly 20,000 species of ants. A student who merely memorized the number 20,000 and associate it with ants will mark that statement as true.
Because they just remember the 20K part.
Right. But the text explicitly designates more than for ants. His statement is false based on the precise wording of the source material. Memorizing the integer is insufficient. You must master the directional modifier attached to it.
That is the definition of a deep dive right there. It really reinforces the idea that studying this material isn't just about absorbing raw fact. It is about rigorous reading comprehension. You have to analyze the text almost like a legal document or a piece of complex poetry, where every single word carries weight and intent.
It requires an incredible amount of discipline to read that way. And that deliberate, structured approach to reading is exactly what the text demands in its very next section. After using these massive numbers to induce that sense of bafflement, the text shifts gears. It moves from showing us the scale of the diversity to showing us how the scientific community attempts to grapple with it. It introduces a framework for inquiry.
Right. The text transitions from the numbers and introduces the professionals who study them. It states, ecologists and evolutionary biologists have been trying to understand the significance of such diversity by asking important questions.
Yes.
This specific phrasing jumped out at me. Why does the text name drop these two specific professions? It doesn't mention geneticists or microbiologists or zoologists. It specifically isolates ecologists and evolutionary biologists as the primary agents trying to understand the significance of this diversity.
That specific pairing is the key to understanding the entire architecture of biological inquiry as presented in this chapter. The text isolates these two fields because they represent the two fundamental intersecting axes along which we study life, time and space.
Time and space. Okay.
Think about what an evolutionary biologist does. They are focused on the temporal axis. They are looking backward into deep time, investigating the past. Their primary concern is origins and mechanisms. How did this biological reality come to be? What were the historical processes of mutation, selection, and speciation that resulted in 300,000 types of beetles?
So they are the historians of the biosphere. They're tracking the lineage.
Exactly. Conversely, look at the ecologist. The ecologist is primarily focused on the spatial axis, the present reality. They are observing the system as it currently operates. Their concern is function and interaction.
So how it all works together right now.
Right. How does this current system sustain itself? How does the population dynamics of that specific ant species impact the reproductive cycle of that specific orchid species within a shared habitat right now?
That is a brilliant way to frame it. Time and space, past origins and present function. You cannot fully understand the significance of the diversity without looking through both of those lenses. And the text then provides the exact lenses we need to use. It lists 6 very specific questions that these scientists ask.
It did.
When I read through these 6 questions, they felt less like a random list of queries and more like a systematic mental map for the entire discipline.
They are absolutely a mental map. And for you listening, this is a crucial pedagogical moment. Do not just read these 6 questions sequentially and try to memorize them as a block of text. To truly internalize them, we need to analyze their underlying logic. We can organize these 6 text-provided questions into 3 distinct conceptual buckets. By grouping them based on their scientific intent, we can build a logical, unforgettable flow that mirrors how a scientist actually approaches a new ecosystem. I find grouping things conceptually is the only way I can retain complex information. Let's build those buckets. Where do we start? We begin with bucket 1, which we can call the origins. This is the domain of the evolutionary biologist. It is concerned with the historical and mechanical how and why of the diversity. The first 3 questions provided in the text fall perfectly into this category. The text asks, question 1, why are there so many species? Question 2, did such a great diversity exist throughout Earth's history? And question 3, how did this diversification come about?
Let's really look at that first question. Why are there so many species? It seems almost childlike in its simplicity, but it is actually the most profound mystery in biology.
It really is.
If you think back to the alien thought experiment, this is the first thing that baffles them. You arrive on a planet, and instead of finding one highly efficient, perfectly adapted superorganism dominating the globe, you find millions of fragmented, highly specialized, interdependent life forms. Asking why there is variety rather than uniformity is the fundamental starting point of evolutionary theory.
It is a recognition of speciation as a phenomenon that demands an explanation. And that naturally leads into question 2. Did such great diversity exist throughout Earth's history? This question forces the student to inject the dimension of time into their understanding of biology. It challenges the common man's assumption that the world has always looked the way it does right now.
It demands that you visualize a dynamic Earth. You have to imagine rewinding the clock millions or billions of years. Imagine if you went back to the Jurassic period. Was the planet this crowded with different life forms? What about before the Cambrian explosion? This question establishes that biodiversity is not a static property of the planet. It is a variable that fluctuates over deep time.
Precisely. It establishes that diversity has a history. And once you acknowledge that the level of diversity changes over time, you are forced to ask question 3. How did this diversification come about? What is the engine driving this change? This is where the scientist moves from observation, the fact that there are many species and historical context, the fact that it wasn't always this way, to the search for actual mechanisms.
This is where you start looking for the rules of the game. What are the environmental pressures, the genetic mutations, the physical barriers that force one species of beetle to splinter into hundreds of thousands over millennia? These 3 questions together form a complete evolutionary investigation, identifying the phenomenon, placing it in history, and determining the mechanism.
Exactly. You have perfectly summarized the evolutionary biologist's approach. But knowing how the machine was built doesn't necessarily tell you how the machine runs. And that brings us to bucket 2, the mechanics.
Okay, so moving to the present.
Yes. This is where we shift from the evolutionary biologist's focus on the past to the ecologist's focus on the functioning present. The text poses 2 questions that define this ecological approach. Question 4, how and why is this diversity important to the biosphere? And question 5, would it function any differently if the diversity was much less?
Question 4, how and why is this diversity important to the biosphere? That's where we start looking at interconnectivity. We aren't just counting the 28,000 species of fishes anymore. We are asking what role they play. Are they stabilizing the food web? Are they filtering the water? The text uses the word important, which implies that diversity isn't just an aesthetic feature of the planet, it is a functional requirement.
It introduces the concept of ecological value. But it's question 5 that I want to deeply emphasize.
Mhm.
The text asks, would it function any differently if the diversity was much less? For any student studying this material, this is the ultimate critical thinking test of the entire chapter introduction. This is the crux of the matter.
It really is. It stops you in your tracks. Would it function any differently if the diversity was much less? It's a massive counterfactual. Think of it like looking at a complex piece of architecture, like a massive Jenga tower, and asking, what happens if I remove half of these blocks?
That is a perfect analogy. The text is demanding that you mentally dismantle the biosphere to understand its structural integrity. It is asking you to hypothesize. If an extinction event wiped out half of those 300,000 beetle species, what is the cascading logical result?
Right. Does the ecosystem does it simply continue with fewer beetles?
Or do the nutrient cycles that those specific beetles facilitate begin to break down? Do the predators that rely on them starve? Does the soil composition change? The author uses this specific question to forcefully pivot the learner from passive observation to active, predictive ecological analysis. You cannot answer this question without understanding how deeply interdependent the system is.
It completely destroys the common man's view of nature as just a collection of separate objects. It forces you to see nature as a single, incredibly complex working machine. If you take out a gear, the machine runs differently or it breaks entirely.
Exactly.
And I think that realization leads perfectly into the final bucket. We've looked at the deep past, we've looked at the complex present mechanics, and that brings us to bucket 3, which I would call the anthropocentric view. The final question the text poses is, how do humans benefit from the diversity of life?
When you analyze the sequence of these 6 questions, what is the most significant shift that occurs with that final question?
Well, it is the very first time in the entire sequence of questions that humans are explicitly centered in the inquiry. We started with the perspective of an alien looking at the whole planet from a distance. Then we looked at deep evolutionary history, long before humans existed. Then we analyzed the mechanical function of the biosphere as an abstract system. And finally, only at the very end do we look at ourselves. We ask, what is in it for us?
That shift from the abstract biosphere to the specific human benefit is incredibly deliberate. It serves a very specific structural purpose in the text.
It feels like a bridge. It bridges the pure science of understanding the system with the applied science of interacting with it. Because, let's be intellectually honest here, human beings are highly pragmatic creatures. We are far more likely to invest resources into conserving a system if we clearly understand how that system benefits our own survival, our economies, or our health. By asking how we benefit, the text aligns the scientific reality of biodiversity with human self-interest.
What is truly fascinating here is that you have just organically deduced the structural roadmap of the entire chapter, simply by following the logical progression of the text introductory questions.
Really? How so?
Look at the very end of the source text. After posing these profound questions, the text concludes with a stark, incredibly simple 3-line structural outline. It reads, 15.1 biodiversity, 15.2 biodiversity conservation. Summary. At first glance, to a student quickly scanning the page, this just looks like standard mandatory textbook formatting. It looks like a table of contents.
It does. It just tells you what the next 2 headings are going to be.
It is standard formatting, but the sequence of those 2 sections represents an inviolable logical progression in biological science. You absolutely cannot skip to section 15.2, biodiversity conservation. It is intellectually impossible to conserve a complex system if you cannot first answer the ecologist's questions about how that system functions in the present. And you cannot fully understand how it functions without answering the evolutionary biologist's questions about how it came to be structured that way over time.
So section 15.1 is the what and the how, And Section 15.2 is the action. You have to map the territory before you can defend it.
Exactly. The text is explicitly telling you that observation and deep, baffling understanding must precede any attempt at protection. It is a linear progression of knowledge. First, you recognize the diversity. That's the alien's amazement. Second, you interrogate its origins and mechanics. That's the 6 questions of 15.1. Only then, third, can you attempt to manage or save it, which is conservation, 15.2. If a student tries to learn the conservation strategies without understanding the staggering complexity of the biodiversity they are trying to conserve, they are merely memorizing disconnected facts. They're acting like the common man trying to do the work of a scientist.
It is genuinely amazing how much intellectual architecture the authors managed to build into roughly 150 words of introductory text. It's not a preamble. It is a complete philosophical and structural primer for the entire field of study. But let's bring this down to the practical level for the listener, for the student who is facing a massive exam, or for anyone who wants to ensure they retain the core framework of this deep dive without getting lost in the philosophical weeds. How do we lock this information down?
This is the crucial final step of any deep learning process. We must synthesize the analysis into actionable, retrievable data. Here's what you must remember. We need to construct some unbreakable memory anchors, starting with the highest yield data points, the numbers. We need a reliable way to recall the 4 specific taxonomic groups and their approximate species counts in ascending order.
So we need to map the progression from the ants and orchids, which sit at the 20,000 threshold, up to the fishes at 28,000, and finally arriving at the massive dominance of the beetles at 300,000.
Yeah, correct. The ascending order of magnitude is ants, orchids, fishes, beetles, AOFB. Now, I know that utilizing mnemonics can sometimes feel a bit elementary, perhaps even counterintuitive when we have just spent so much time discussing the deep philosophical implications of the text. However, when you're sitting in a high-stakes testing environment, staring down a complex multiple-choice question under intense time pressure, cognitive fatigue sets in.
Oh, absolutely. Your brain just freezes up sometimes.
In those moments, having a simple, automatic mental anchor saves you from second-guessing yourself. I always advise my students to use this specific phrase. All orchids fascinate beetles.
All orchids fascinate beetles. AOFB.
Let's break it down to be absolutely clear. A is for ants. And remember the crucial modifier, more than 20,000 species. O is for orchids, with a modifier nearly 20,000 species. F is for fishes, sitting clearly at 28,000 species. B is for beetles, the absolute maximum in this text, dominating at 300,000 species. The sentence, all orchids fascinate beetles, not only gives you the letters, but it locks in the precise ascending volume of the species counts presented by the author.
All orchids fascinate beetles. It is highly effective because it is also weirdly thematic. It makes you visualize a massive swarm of beetles staring at an orchid, which links right back to the biological focus of the text. It anchors the data in an image.
Visual anchors are always the strongest. Now, beyond just the numbers, we need to ensure the conceptual framework is equally secure. To bring this entire discussion together, here is your rapid-fire 60-second sticky summary. These are the 5 critical structural facts derived from this text that a student cannot afford to misunderstand. Number 1, the framing. The text utilizes the perspective of an advanced alien to teach us that Earth's biological diversity is objectively staggering. The primary pedagogical goal is to force the learner to abandon the complacency of the common man and approach the subject with intellectual bafflement.
Got it. Bafflement is the goal.
Number 2, the absolute data hierarchy. You must lock in the numbers and their specific modifiers. Ants are more than 20K, orchids are nearly 20K, fishes are 28K, and beetles are the undisputed maximum at 300K. Examiners will test your precision on those modifiers and your recognition of the beetle's dominance. Number 3, the professional axis. The text establishes 2 primary lenses of inquiry: ecologists, who study the mechanics of the present space, and evolutionary biologists, who study the origins across deep time.
Time and space.
Number 4, the structure of inquiry. The 6 foundational questions are not random. They are categorized. They guide the learner from analyzing past origins, why and how it happened, to present mechanics, how it functions and what happens if it is reduced, and finally to anthropocentric pragmatism, how humans benefit. And number 5, the logical sequence of the discipline. This entire line of questioning creates an unbreakable linear roadmap. You must thoroughly understand the staggering complexity of the system, Section 15.1, before you can possibly formulate strategies to protect it, Section 15.2.
So what does this all mean? That is a masterclass in reading comprehension. We started this deep dive looking at what appeared to be a tiny, perhaps skippable 150-word introduction to a textbook chapter. And by applying rigorous analysis, what we found was that it is not merely a preamble, It is the master blueprint for the entire study of ecology and evolution. It challenges us to look at our own world through the objective, bewildered eyes of an alien visitor. It demands that we appreciate the staggering mathematical reality of even the smallest creatures, like the ants and the beetles. And most importantly, it teaches us that systematically asking the right questions about history, about function, and about our own reliance on the system is the only way we can ultimately learn how to save the biosphere that sustains us.
It is a text that demands active engagement from the reader, and that active engagement should not end when you close the book. I want to leave you with one final, essential thought to consider, something to mull over as you process the implications of this deep dive. We spent significant time analyzing the ecologist's critical question, would the biosphere function any differently if the diversity was much less? The text asks you to imagine the breakdown of the system. As you go about your day-to-day, look outside. Look at a tree, look at the soil, look at the birds or insects interacting in that space, and ask yourself this. If that imaginary, highly advanced alien from a distant galaxy were to return to Earth in 1,000 years, what would be their reaction? Would they still be intellectually baffled by the enormous, thriving diversity of life? Or would they be profoundly baffled by how quickly the common man allowed it to disappear?
That is an incredibly powerful, sobering thought to leave on, and it perfectly encapsulates the urgency hidden within this textbook introduction. Thank you so much for guiding us through this and breaking down the architecture of the text. For everyone listening, I hope you carry this alien perspective with you into your continued studies, into your exam preparations, and out into the way you view the world. Stay curious, keep asking those difficult structural questions, and we will catch you on the next deep dive.